Okay.
Father, we just thank you and we praise you for this day. Thank you for your provision and the technology that lets us get together. I just pray, Father, that you bless the study.
Yes.
Lord, take the work that I put into this and make it yours, Father, and just help the right words to be spoken and the message to be clear and what you want us to get out of this to be clear to each of us. Hashem Yeshua HaMashiach, I pray.
Amen.
All right, so we are in Acts.
Chapter 27, 33 to chapter 28, 6.
Yes. So go ahead. I'm going to do my usual recap and then we'll read this section here.
Okay.
So last time when we were in Acts, we were leading up to the infamous shipwreck here. Paul had pronounced an oracle of doom upon the voyage when they were sitting in a harbor off the coast of Crete, right? So Luke recorded that it, much as though it were an oracle, he used Greek wording that implied that Paul had seen the events, much like an oracle or a psychic might. So now we know Paul was pronouncing a prophecy, one that would soon be made known, but at the time we can assume that it was said in a way intended to play upon the superstitions of the people, because he was dealing with people who were not godly at all. So, however, we also know that Paul warned them about how their decisions could affect them, and sure enough, no one wanted to listen, right? So I highlighted the possible motivations for why the various parties on the ship would have ignored the lateness of the season, the obvious risks in pushing forward. Ultimately, God allowed them to reach the next harbor, another place that would likely have been safe to wait out the winter, but instead, and that was the Phoenix Bay. Instead, they took mild south wind as an omen to keep going and set sail. And then it wouldn't take long before the great Euclidon came along, drove them south, sheltered for a time at the small island of Galdos. They undergirded the ship, pulled up the skiff, hunkering in for the storm. Soon enough, the storm led them first to dump the cargo, then the tackle. And after a time, Paul decided to point out to them that they'd all been warned that this exact situation would happen. However, he informed them that God had sent a messenger to share the news that all aboard the ship would be saved, but that they would wreck upon an island. And after 14 days, they finally began to approach land. And we left off with the sailors attempting to flee the boat when Paul warned the centurion and he had taken action to stop them. Dad, would you like to read the first section for us?
Didn't bring my glasses in, but I can see them on the screen. Of course, you may have to blow them up to one word a page, but
yeah, I get it.
As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength. For not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you." And when he said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were in all 276 people in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. Now, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the rudder and left them in the sea. Yes, the anchors, and left them in the sea. At the same time, loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow struck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make it to the land, the rest on planks or in pieces of the ship. So it was that all who were brought safely to land.
All right.
Welcome, Jan.
Thank you, guys. Sorry I was late.
Oh, no worries. All right. So Luke notes that as day was rapidly approaching, Paul encouraged them to eat. So I kind of wanted to dig into that for a moment. So at this point, we are told it had been nearly 2 weeks since they had eaten. So we recalled our last discussion about the practice of fasting to make one right with one's God, right? These men assumed they were simply dead men walking. And as such, they stopped caring about eating or food. 14 days is what Luke notes here, and it suggests that from the moment the storm blew over them, they had not bothered to eat. Now, medical experts have looked at this over different times and studied situations of starvation over the years to understand the effects and the ultimate length that an individual can go, right? So the maximum amount can vary by the individual, but it's known to be between 1 and 2 months. So we're talking 30 to 60 days. Based on studying people who voluntarily gave up food, shows that death typically takes place between day 45 and day 61. So depending upon the health, fat stores in the individual at the beginning of the period of fasting. Starvation has a number of negative effects as well. It affects pulse, blood pressure. It can lead to heart failure. It can cause stomach pain, vomiting, nausea, and it'll make it very difficult to concentrate and affect the ability to sleep. Did you have something done?
Your body leaches calcium from your bones.
Right, and body leaches calcium from the bones, so the bones can become brittle. And I actually had that as my next statement here. The core temperature will drop, leading to hypothermia. People in starvation mode will have dry skin, brittle hair, hair loss, and the first symptoms of starvation would have likely set in by this point, right? And that includes weakness, faster heart rate, shallow breathing, extreme thirst and constipation. The eyes begin to sink in and glass over. The muscles begin to become smaller and wasting sets in.
Do you know why they vomit? Anyone?
Mm-mm.
No,
Because, go on.
I don't know. There's no food in there. How can they?
Well, it's because your stomach produces a form of acid that'll break down tissue, right? So the stomach starts overproducing the acid and it begins to irritate because there's nothing in there, the stomach, until finally all you can do is vomit to throw it up.
Oh, wow.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And that will eat your stomach away if you did not.
Yeah.
So in other words, Paul was looking at these men and seeing the effects of these 2 weeks of waiting. He referred to them as pros docontes, and that means an expectation, looking for hope. You see here this meekness, this waiting sort of thing, waiting to see what will come. And it's in our translation here, we have it as in suspense. So Paul reiterates a second time the importance of eating in this moment. And he tells his companions soterios, and that means deliverance, preservation, safety, and salvation. He's specifically telling them, for you, salvation, right? So here in our translation, we have this give you strength, which is not actually in the scripture. What he is saying is that he's talking not about the effects of the food, he's talking about that they will be delivered, right? So he's trying to give them hope.
Right.
Is what's going on here. It's not about the food. The food is a way of him saying, you have hope now. You don't need to keep fasting. You're not going to die. So therefore take sustenance, right? He's encouraging them to eat because they will be saved. Their prayers will be answered, that whole thing. And he adds to it. Yeah, go ahead. Megan's got a.
They also needed the strength to swim to shore.
True enough, but from what's written in the Greek, that was not actually emphasis, even though that's what got added into it. And then he adds to them when he references the idea that not only will they be saved, but they will be unharmed. He tells them, "Udeno gar hemon thrix apo tis kaphiles pesete." So I'm going to just break this down. This is we see this in other places in scripture. And I realized I forgot to put the full translation down at the bottom, so I do apologize. But I'll talk through it. So udino means not one or no one. Gar means truly, verily, factually. Hemon being you, thrix being hair of the head, apotes of the, kaphiles being the head. And the most important part, and lastly, pesetai, which is to fall from or to be thrust down. In other words, not one, in truth, of your hair of the head will be destroyed or lost, fall from your head, etc. Right now, keep in mind, starvation affects their hair's already falling out.
Right, would be.
So this is not a literal, no hair is going to be lost. This is a figurative sense, and we see this in other places. We see the same wording in the one example that couple examples from Luke 21:18. Yeshua tells his disciples about the prophetic future when everything will seem hopeless. He mentions the reference to no hairs will be lost, and so it's not surprising to see the same author using these wording. And it's so it suggests that this was possibly a colloquialism of the time. So you have this phrasing that's used to suggest a commonly held concept. And we see it also in Samuel and Kings. In other places, the reference to hairs of the head are how God suggests our importance In Luke 12:7, we have Yeshua saying, why even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, you are of more value than many sparrows. So since we shed our hair daily, the idea that God even cares about how many hairs we have on our head sets the expectation of the value he places on each life. And that's, I think, what the emphasis here is not so much about the hair itself, but about the value of each individual, that they would come out of this unharmed.
And this, when I read this years ago, and that I still remember the plane crash I was in, and I realized why it's hard to track down. We tried to, when I shared that part of my testimony and crashed in Los Angeles, is that there were no computers that we used at that time. It wasn't until the 90s, early 90s, we started having computers, for everything. And it wasn't until many years after that everything was put in. So in microfiche somewhere is that accident when the United plane, and I do know it was United. And I told the people point blank, not one of you will perish. We will all walk away. I don't think I used the term hair's the head, but that's what God gave me. They got mad at me because I was reading the Bible and not getting all worked up when they're all freaking out.
So Luke concludes this message by noting that after Paul had said his piece, he took food and proceeded to give thanks to God. Specifically in Greek, we have the word arton. And arton, it generally translates as bread, though it can also refer to food in general. So in case you're unaware, also adding to this is what Paul says is that he gave a blessing. And so most likely this would have been the Hebrew blessing over bread that we've heard from us before. Right, so this would have been, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. He would have said that. Whether the only people who would have known what he meant would have been any other Hebrew speakers on the boat. He would have most likely, since the custom has been for thousands of years to sing this, to chant it over the bread before breaking it, he would have most likely have done exactly that. Now, in Hebrew fashion, he breaks this bread before eating it. Now, we don't know exactly what this bread is, but we can theorize what it is. Because if we go back 6,000 years to the history of bread, what we see is that in sailing from the dawn of time is the practice of using hardtack, what we call hardtack today. It's essentially it's the equivalent of a hard flat cracker made simply with water, flour, and salt. It's typically baked repeatedly to drive out any moisture so that it won't spoil. So this would have been very important for sailing, because what they would then do is they would store it inside of, at this time, it would have been a jar filled with this bread. So he would have cracked one open and pulled out the wafers of the crackers of bread before then giving them out to everybody. And knowing that they came from Egypt, the Egyptians referred to it specifically as dura, and by the Egyptians they call it but kelim. So from this name, the hardtack, right, you can imagine it's tough, it's dry, and it had to be kept dry, because if it got even a little bit of moisture in it, it would start to mold very rapidly. So the typical practice that was done with this bread was you would soak it in water, because otherwise you could break your teeth on it.
In Vietnam, we still had what they had in World War II and World War I, which was sea rations, or hardtack, they called it. And it was bread, just like Daniel's described. And we'd take it in our coffee or water, and we'd soak it till we could finally bite off a piece of it.
Right. And in this case, we don't know if he soaked it or not. All we know is that he took the cracker and broke it. And then probably begin nibbling upon it, because that's typically the other description is if you don't soak it, you kind of have to gnaw on it. Yeah, gnaw on it to break off little pieces.
Yes, I agree.
So just thought I would share that little historical tidbit. So now we know that his words, his actions, they get some effect. Luke records that they were all euthymoi, well disposed of good cheer, right? So they're encouraged. And then they start eating themselves. So this is good. And then Luke notes, he makes an interesting little note here. He mentions specifically that the ship had 276 souls on it, or people. So I did some quick searching for how to calculate the size of the boat. And there's a couple different opinions of how big a boat needs to be based on a specific capacity. You're assuming a certain weight per person. So what we know is that in order to hold 276 people safely, at that assumption of about 150 pounds per person, you can figure out the surface area by length and width of the boat, and you divide that by 15. It was one website. So if we reverse the math, we get the approximate area to be like 4,000 or so square feet. And so we can assume then if it's a width of 30 feet, then the boat was somewhere around 138 feet. Another website suggested dividing by 18, and that gets us more of like 165 feet by 30 feet. So that gives you a little bit of scale. So I did a little bit of researching. So what types of ships during this era could potentially have been big enough to hold this many people? The first one was this Roman biremus. It was typically around 60 to 70 meters in length. So that's 180 to 210 feet. So that fits within our parameters of what we know. Sported 2 masts. So we know it had masts and it had sails, but it had oars. There's no reference whatsoever in anything Luke wrote about oars. So probably not this particular ship.
Yeah, because they had all been rowing, including Paul, if that had been the case.
To try and keep the ship under control. Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. So we can take that one probably off the table. The next one here is this one called the Honoraria. It does have a foresail. So that's one thing. It was considered a standard freighter, the Roman merchant fleets, so that we have that going for it. And it was a deep drafted ship. So we know this was a deep drafted ship because of all of the descriptions they give us, the worries about sandbars, all this stuff, right? So there's that. And it lacked oars, so that's something different too. Fits the story a little bit better. However, the size of these typical ships is about half that of the biremus. So might have been a little bit tight for 275 people to fit. Just the reality of the situation. So with that, and the typical complement of this had about 10 sailors. So it doesn't seem possible that this could hold the necessary cargo and people of nearly 300 people. So it seems improbable. The last one that I found, and I'm pretty sure this has got to be it, is called the Corbita. The Corbita, because the Corbita was a common sailing vessel. It was a cargo ship. It was known to travel Mediterranean between Alexandria and Rome. And it could carry 400 passengers. It was 55 meters long by 13 meters wide. That's 165 feet by 78 feet. So that well fits within the scale of the numbers. And it was incredibly slow.
That would work too. Yeah.
So knowing how long the scale of what we get from what Luke describes, this is most likely the ship that they were sailing on. And you can see here, they have top sails and they have a foresail. So either one, because we know we have that reference there. So they could have removed the entire mast and only had that foresail, but either way, this ship does meet our description from Luke as being the likely thing. It's a deep drafted vessel. It would have had more than enough space to carry an additional boat on it as needed. It had the sails, there were no oars, yeah, and it had the capacity. So moving on beyond ships.
At least you know what he sailed in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I really had some fun digging this stuff up, certainly. So Luke goes on to tell us they ate their fill. This is translated as ate enough, and the Greek word here is choresthentes, and that refers to being satiated, right? Or even to have every wish satisfied. So in other words, they started eating and they ate until they no longer felt hungry. So after 2 weeks of fasting, that would have been a lot, right? To eat till you're satiated after that long.
Your stomach shrinks though.
It does, but at the same time, the sense of hunger, though,
Well,
doesn't
it's
just go away
having
right away.
having the longest fast I was able to do was 29 days. And I can only say when I had meat, I was drunk as if I'd been drunk on liquor. I had some meat at a restaurant and I had a piece of bread too. And the bread tasted like honey wafers from heaven. Later, I went back and it tasted like bread.
So knowing how hardtack is to eat, this actually would have probably taken quite a while. So they would have definitely, there's no sense of hurrying in this. So I imagine it would have taken a while. And then he notes that they tossed all the cetone, specifically the grain, in that word typically refers to wheat, into the sea. Now we know that they tossed overboard the cargo before, right? So this is probably in reference to the stuff that it was for the sailors to eat specifically. Because they would have typically in sailing, there would have been the hardtack, but they also would have had grain that could have been cooked and prepared fresh. Because the hardtack was really there for things like when there's a storm and you don't have the ability to actually take the time to prepare food. So what's interesting here is, in my mind, I was envisioning in all of this, the Aegis sail, the sealed wooden barrels, etc., right? They're tossing those overboard. At this time, though, however, we know that what they did is they stored everything in amphora. And I mentioned earlier about the earthenware jugs and containers, and I probably should have included a picture of them. But basically, think of a very large, heavy jar, ceramic jar with big, huge handles. It would have taken 2 people to move. And these are very heavy things, and they tend to sink, right? So we find the whole Mediterranean is covered in 2 things: ships and amphora. The whole floor of the Mediterranean. They said that that's why they know so much about the ships of that era, because so many of them sank.
That was good.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's the research I found, was that was the consistent message. These merchant ships sank so often that they know exactly what they ate, what they stored, what they transported, quantities of materials that were sent back and forth. All this stuff was very, very obviously apparent because of the wreckage in the bottom of the Mediterranean.
Well, yeah, I do.
Okay.
I'm going to take us on a sidetrack. When they went down searching for these ships to get an idea of Roman history, Egyptian history, and that, they also found other things as they began to dust through the sand, cities. The Mediterranean used to have a major population with roads and cities, and it's all underwater.
You can find roads in the areas of the Atlantic as well.
Yes.
So we know that there were, if not another continent, there were at least islands that have since sunk beneath the ocean. So it's an interesting thing to think about. One theory, it's a very far out there theory, but one theory is that when the flood took place, some of the continents shifted, because we know we have areas of land that were underwater at one point, like deserts and that here in our continent. And so one theory is that in the violence of the flood, there were some continents and some land masses that sank and others that rose. So when everything came back down and settled, now you have areas that were once ocean that were now land and vice versa. And so that's why we have underwater cities now, right? And that's where you get things like the myths of Atlantis, and things of that nature, because there were mankind, Noah's family would have brought forward with them stories of the peoples that had been on the earth, and those would have gotten carried forward as myths.
And they had 1,000 years. And if you figure, when you take Adam, he knew all the animals. How intelligent was he? Mm-hmm. What was mankind in the beginning before we devolved? I like the word evolved to where we're at now, where we don't even understand an animal, but machines have now told us a dog. There's 5 different, well, that was about 10 years ago. They had translated 5 different dog languages.
Huh.
Yeah, so we know that animals have unique sounds that they make, and so it's not outside the realm of possibility to consider that animals have their own languages. We just don't understand it, right? Because they are communicating with each other. You know they're communicating with each other. We often make assumptions about what that communication looks like, but who's to say that it isn't through their own dialect of language, right? So, but I did want to touch on why are they throwing all this stuff overboard? So if you're not familiar with boats, I mentioned it was deep drafted. That means there's a lot of ship under the surface of the water. By reducing the weight, that would have brought the keel, the boat itself would have been higher on the water. They're trying, because they know they're coming into land, they want to reduce the risk of getting hung up on something, which obviously it didn't work, but that was what they were trying to do. So that's the reason, because they're trying to get close enough. They want to get to the beach if they can, but want to get close enough that they can swim to shore. So now we're going to get here to this point where they're at day, right? So they're at the day now. They don't recognize the land, but they want to get to there, because we have this reference here of they see this kolpon, which it translates roughly as bosom, which is an interesting word. It is basically, it's the reference of the space between the arms and the body. And so if you think about a bay that way, right, you can think of it like the Gulf of Mexico, for example, would be an example. It would fit within this word, this kolpon, this Greek word. So this is like essentially an area of land that is curved and circular with an opening into it. So that's what you can picture with this, what they're describing here. So it's a calm body of water. You've got land to either side, an opening. It's an ideal place for a ship to land, especially in this case, right? Because they have less risk of being washed back out. Typically, it's a little bit calmer, a little bit quieter. But we also have this note that none of the crew recognized the land. So that suggests that none of them had visited this particular location, which we know as Malta. But they decide, okay, we're going to drive the ship to the shore. So Luke notes a series of steps that they take. First thing they do is he notes that they paralantes the anchors, and that word refers to the act of casting off, casting loose, or taking away something altogether. So we can get the impression from that is that they cut the ropes of the anchors, allowing the ship to move freely. Because remember, they dropped 4 anchors behind the ship to stop it from moving during the night, so that because they were afraid of what might happen. So they cut the ropes, allow the ship move freely, and that means they've given up the option of being able to anchor again. He then notes that they loosened the ropes or binding the rudders, right? So a typical Roman ship had at least 2 rudders. And I'm actually going to go back for a second to that picture we had here. You see, let me put my pointer out here as a laser pointer. So you see this here. This was the rudder, and there were 2 of them, one on either side of the ship. You can see it here in the same thing with the Onanera. So these big, huge paddles. And so they were connected similarly to what we think of as a ship's wheel today, but they were connected to each other through a rope and pulley system, so that the person standing up here on the forecastle, he was moving those rudders, those big, huge oars, from angling them with his ropes. So that's essentially what we're referring to here. And in order to keep the ship from the rudders from breaking in the storm, they would have tied those down so that the ropes wouldn't have been able to move to keep the rudders rigid. So just, visually thinking about that, that's what we're referring here to when we say loosening the ropes of the rudder. So now they're allowing the rudders to move again, theoretically, so that they can guide the ship. Then it says they apparantes the artemona. The apparantes refers to the act of lifting up, raising up, or placing something on high, which is why I think we see it translated as a foresail in our translation here, but because they're raising it up, my thought is it's probably more likely, because that word also means top sail, artemona. So more likely it's that they saved the top sail, maybe because it was too hard to get it down when they were removing the tackle and the sails from the ship when they were throwing them overboard at one point, in order to, because sails moving around in a storm can be very, very dangerous, because you can get hit by them.
Knocked off the ship.
Exactly. So they would have, the big sails gone, but they probably saved the small sail, because that gives them some ability to maneuver.
It also, by using the small sail on these ships, by the way, your speed is more controllable. You'll have less speed, even if there's high wind.
Right. So but either way, what we get from this is that they've given themselves the ability to maneuver the ship to some degree. So now they're trying to make it to the beach, but instead we're told that by Luke that, however, they hit this, they perepisantes. That means they fell into something. It's encompassed by it. And it's a tapon diathalason, which refers to a space marked by a reef. Or the diathalason could also reference an isthmus or tongue of land covered by waves. So you can picture it as you've got two competing, and this is how it was kind of described, two competing sections of waves that are pushing sand up into a sandbar that they didn't see until it was too late, right? So that's what they drove that ship into. So this was their original fear, right? When the storms first began, they were afraid they'd be driven into the sandbars in the south. Instead, they ended up on a sandbar anyway, because once a ship this deep, once it's lodged, it's basically done. And now you've got these competing waves, which results in going from this absolutist, this unshaken, unmoved, firm, stable situation. We now have this description of extreme stresses on the ship, right? The waves are attempting to move the immovable ship. So you have this effect now where it refers to the stern as being elieto, or as Thayer's describes it, it's derived from the word leo, which refers to loosening, unbinding, or dissolving.
Mhm.
So remember, they had tied all these ropes around the ship to keep it together. Well, now those stresses aren't being resisted anymore because now the ship is being twisted from the waves. So it's beginning to come apart.
Want to share something here that is a tidbit. For years, the Western world followed the design of the Romans, even when they worked with metal. In World War I and II, our ships were known to break apart in the center whenever the waves got bad, because they had made them along this line with metal. And so when the waves started pushing back and forth on it like this, the ships would break apart, and we lost a lot of people in the ocean.
Yeah. So, well, and considering how many vessels we know are sunk to the bottom of the Mediterranean, the Romans were not great shipbuilders. I hate to say it, the evidence does not suggest that they built ships that were known for staying afloat. So, now, yeah,
The pieces of them floated quite often, but
yeah. So, moving on. In this next part here, we know that Luke, he notes that he overhears, or what appears to be overhearing, the soldiers. They're making a boule. And a boule is a council or purpose, a deliberation, a decree. In other words, it sounds to me like overheard conversation or counsel regarding what to do with the prisoners. They begin to realize they're losing control of the situation. Per Luke, the decision was leaning toward killing the prisoners, which we can assume included Luke. We talked at length about this earlier in Acts, how the guards were responsible for their captives, right? The guard's life was forfeit should any captives be lost. Therefore, the soldiers were looking at it practically. Should any of the prisoners escape during the swim to shore, these soldiers would have been put to death, or at the least suffer the same fate as the lost prisoner, take their place, whatever was intended for them. So to us, this might seem cruel, but this was the world of the Roman soldiers. So this is practical thinking. However, we're told about that the centurion was, in our translation, he was wishing to save Paul, Julius the centurion. And Luke notes it in the Greek, boulomenos diaosesai. Boulomenos means will, wish, deliberate action, purpose. And diaosesai, we've encountered many times, means to preserve through danger, through safely, or to save. So all this is in reference to Paul specifically. And from Luke's notes, it appears to have nothing to do with the rest of the prisoners, but because Julius could not bear to see Paul slain. So now this might be because of Paul's status as a Roman citizen, number one. It might have been because of the specific plea to Caesar. However, I personally believe this goes back to the reason that Luke knew the man's name in the first place. Julius had been placed over Paul for more than 2 years. Again, this is me theorizing based on all the little tiny bits and pieces of evidence that we have, guarding him, and subsequently been taught the gospel. So it is my personal belief that Julius had a very unique perspective on Paul as being a man of God, not just a prisoner.
Could he also have become a Christian himself?
And that is a possibility. I don't know if you caught that. My mother mentioned that maybe he had become a Christian himself. And that is something that we could theorize. We don't know for sure, but we see lots of little pieces of evidence. I mentioned before, when they reached that first port, that Julius let Paul go out on his own cognition, his own expectation that Paul would return, and let him go out to get food supplies and meet with friends. So, that's unique in itself. And when we consider that whole relationship of guard versus prisoner. Now, Luke notes that Julius, at this point, he echolysins the intent of the soldiers. And echolysin means to cut off, cut short, hinder, prevent, or forbid. So we can use any of those words here to refer specifically to this idea of kept them from carrying out their plan. Now, as Julius being over everyone, his word would have been final. So we can kind of imagine that there's a couple different explanations for how this worked out. And this is me because I love to visualize this stuff. Now, it's possible that the soldiers were huddled together discussing this, and he comes suggesting killing the prisoners. They start nodding, and up walks Julius. He overhears the words. He quickly intervenes, takes charge. Alternatively, Julius calls up the captains because he would have had men that were over the individual hundred or the individual groups of the squadron leaders, if you will. Though, if I remember correctly, the structure is more like he had 10 captains underneath of him as the centurion. And each one of them would have been over 10 soldiers underneath them. So he's got his captains together. He's asking for opinions. Luke sneaks up. He hears the captains suggesting the prisoners are a liability. Julius considers it, then proposes another thought. And then Luke interprets this based on his knowledge of Julius. Either way, we get the impression Julius has no plans to kill anyone. His goal is to see everyone safe through the land. Perhaps he's concerned about Paul's well-being, or maybe about the prophecy of all or nothing. And he was, recall, he was perfectly quick to cut the ropes when it looked like the sailors might try to run. His solution is actually quite elegant, right? He's, in its simplicity, he sends soldiers who can swim to the land first. They'll be able to set up a perimeter, herd the prisoners together easily as they come ashore, and this ensures that no one escapes, right? So it also ensures that if there are any dangers awaiting them, the trained fighting men are at the ready. So you have to admire Julius's creativity in this situation, as well as putting the safety of the whole before the individual.
Right.
And then in this last verse in the chapter, we see that many of those on board the ship were not able to swim. Or at least that's the impression we get from this. Luke notes that some made the trip on boards or planks. Others are recorded as being on tenon ton ap tu ploio. So the key words here are tenon, which is a vague word that tends to get interpreted as pieces. However, the word actually means someone or something, some object, basically. So I would propose, in ploios being ship, but we've already referenced planks, right? Planks are pieces of the ship, in theory. So I would propose that the intended translation should be more along the lines of someone from the ship. This is me extrapolating, but I think it makes a bit of sense, right? You've got those that can swim, they can carry someone who can't, right? It's not that hard to imagine arms around the shoulders or neck riding on the back of the swimmer.
Mm-hmm.
I think that makes probably more sense. Yeah, that probably makes more sense to me than saying planks and pieces of the ship. Because what else are you going to ride across on? You can't ride on sails, right? Pieces of sail, you're going to get caught up in that, tangled up, and you're going to drown. We're already planks. The ship is made of planks. The ship is breaking apart. What other planks would they have? They're not going to keep a bunch of, they may keep some wood, but that stuff is probably part of the gear and tackle that was tossed overboard early on. So again, what makes sense, and I think it makes more sense here to consider that rather than something from the ship, that it's someone. How vague is Luke usually? It's not usually that vague, but regardless of the truth here, we know that the situation is resolved by telling us that the pantos de sotheni, right? All or everyone was preserved through danger and saved. So, we conclude that voila, we're on the beach, everybody's happy and alive. Okay, would someone like to read these 6 verses of 28 for us? Because that will be our last of our study today.
Okay, I'll read them.
Thank you, Jane.
After we were brought safely through, we then learned that the island was called Malta. The native people showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and welcomed us all, because it had begun to rain and was cold. When Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. When the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man is a murderer. Though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." He, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. They were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But when they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. Boy, talk
Now-
about a bad day. Whoa.
Oh, yeah.
I know.
But this is something I tried to stress when I was sharing two parts of my life. I shared two parts of my testimony, and that got us as far as Fresno, California. What I'd like to share with you is, as I tried to point out my own dealings with God, right along with the goodness of God, there was the enemy. He always comes in somewhere. And so as Paul had told these people they would live and it was born fruit, the enemy brought in a viper, which probably from that area of the world, they have some very deadly poisonous snakes.
And I'll talk about that here in a moment. Yeah.
Daniel's going to go into that.
Yep.
And so if it hadn't been for God, he would have died.
Yep.
So again, the enemy strikes. You have to remember, if God's going to bless you, you're going to go through the fire.
So Luke doesn't specifically state to us how they discovered that they landed on Malta. And I'm actually going to go down here really quickly and we can see the map of the Mediterranean here. So this is Malta here. So you can see it's a small island south of Sicily. So they're actually not that far from Italy at this point. Not exactly, I think, where they necessarily intended, but as you can see, looking at the map, they would have had to, if they were going directly to Rome, they would have had to go south of Sicily anyway, because there's not really an easy way otherwise, because it's a pretty narrow pass through between Sicily and Italy there. So that's where they were at. So we're gonna kind of talk through a little bit about this, but Malta specifically, just kind of give you a little bit of reference, or Meliti, is today it's known as the Republic of Malta. It's a member of the EU, and the origin of the name Meliti comes from the Greek word meli, which translates as honey, making the full name roughly honey sweet. So Malta has a unique subspecies of honeybee. So that would have been something they were known for. The islands has evidence suggesting inhabitation back to like 5900 BC, based on our science methods of dating. And it's always been considered a key port location because it's kind of a position in the center of the Mediterranean. So, and interestingly, the Greeks colonized the islands of Malta, and it is islands. There's multiple little small islands there, around 700 BC. And we have multiple historical references from the time of Paul that refer to the Temple of Juno and the wealth of the Maltese. So I think it is important to reference that, because when we start talking about the people that they encounter, they're referred to as actually being barbaroi, or barbaros. And you may recognize this word from the word barbarian, which is in our English language. Now, we have it translated as native people, but it's really not an accurate way of describing them. In fact, it's a very poor translation of the word, because what the word really means is that it was applied to any non-Greek speaking individual. So basically what that means is these people either speak poor Greek or no Greek at all. And so that's why you'll see over and over again, Luke refers to them as barbaroi. He doesn't call them natives. He doesn't call them Malteans. He calls them barbaroi. So that implies that they were difficult to understand at best. So wherever they landed, it's not near one of the Greek colonies. We can know that absolutely. It also suggests that we need to go back in history a little bit to understand the inhabitants of the island. This island had been inhabited by Sicilians, so those would have been Latin speakers. It had been inhabited by Phoenicians. Phoenicians might very well have spoken, Phoenicians would be like Syria area. So you've got possibility of like a Semitic language.
And then on the coast of Africa, we had their cities too.
And the Carthaginians also colonized Malta. So that would have brought in a form of Arabic, potentially. So you've got a variety of different interesting languages here.
Well,
so,
at this time, it wouldn't. No, not at this time, I don't think. Or Arabic.
Arabic is an ancient language.
You might be right.
It's
Never mind.
derived from cuneiform, but it is.
But most of the people think that you've got your Canaanites, and then they
Right.
became Sidonians.
Sumerians.
No, not Sumerians, Sidonians.
Oh, okay.
And then they became Phoenicians
right.
as a mixtures of people. And so it changed from Canaan to Phoenicians. So go on.
The reason why I jumped on the piece of Arabic, though, is because the Maltese language as it is today is actually a blend of Latin and Arabic.
Yes, it is. You're perfectly right.
So we have an amalgamation of various people groups. So what we can get from the reference to being barbaroi specifically is that Luke is referencing to the fact that they are not educated Greeks, basically.
Right. They hadn't gone to Greek school.
So, and you can see here, I've got this expanded definition of what barbaroi means about just the different things at this time, what that sort of referenced. And then I just wanted to note here that Luke is very surprised by their unusual kindness, as he refers to it, or benevolence. And he knows that they kindled the fire for the survivors. And because we have this reference to rain and cold, we can assume that they either put up shelter or had shelter that they invited them into, even though he doesn't specifically mention it. Otherwise, it really doesn't make sense, because if it's rainy and cold, a fire is not going to do very well, right? Unless it has some sort of a cover. So now, Paul not being the type to be idle, it's noted by Luke that he had gathered a bundle of fergannon, and that's just dry sticks, twigs, brushwood, etc. Fuel for the fire. And upon laying the wood upon the fire, Luke notes that an echidna, or viper, cathepsin, and that's cathepsin upon his hand, right? And that's the act of fastening, binding, laying hold of, etc. And in context, the reference appears to be the biting of the flesh with fangs. Now, the most common species of viper found in the Mediterranean is the viper ammodytes. And this common name for the snake is called the horned viper, long-nosed viper, or the most common being the sand viper. And it's considered to be the most dangerous of the viper species found in southern Europe. It has long fangs. Well, I guess they're not that long. As Megan pointed out, some snakes have significantly longer fangs, but it's about a ½ inch long. So, you take half your thumb, and that's roughly how long those fangs were. Now, and Megan might want to jump in and share a little bit of her knowledge of snakes, but it had a particularly toxic venom, which is not uncommon with smaller fanged snakes. The sand viper was about 33.5 inches long as their average. And their temperament can vary based on the snake itself. So this is an unusual snake in that the temperament's not consistent. So a lot of snakes, like for example, what do you want to call it? A rattler is very consistent in that they will always rattle their tail before they strike as warning, right? This snake, on the other hand, has been known to have varying temperaments. It can bite immediately without warning. It can hiss, or it can run away. All three are known behaviors of this particular snake. But the venom itself has a variety of compounds. It actually has 3 different compounds in it. It's a proteolytic, which dissolves proteins. It has neurotoxins, that's paralytics, and it has a hemotoxin that disrupts clotting and destruction of red blood cells.
And any cells that it comes in contact with.
Right.
Hemotoxins just explode your cells, basically.
Right. And so the symptoms of this bite includes pain, swelling, discoloration, which will occur within moments of the bite. People typically report, I mentioned swelling. Most people report dizziness and tingling as well. And so you can imagine with the distinctive snake, likely well-known consequences are really present here.
Mm-hmm.
So did you have anything you wanted to add about the snake? So I know you.
Well, yeah, we had talked about, the snake with the longest fangs in the world is the gaboon viper with 2-inch fangs.
Yeah. So.
They of course they fold into the mouth and then they come out. But yeah, so a ½ inch is actually pretty short. A venomous snake with a shorter fang is likely to be more aggressive and have a deadlier poison or venom because of the fact that they don't have the long fangs to get as good of a grip on a bite as others would. So they need to be able to quickly bite, inject, and then they likely fall off or
Run away.
yeah.
So now, I think predictably, the natives see this as an omen, right? The sand viper, I mentioned, it has different temperaments, so it's not a predictable snake. They observe this violent attack without warning or to be a sign that Paul is not a good man. Is basically how we get this. From the overheard conversation, we can presume that the barbarians have been informed of Paul's status as a prisoner. And we can presume that some of them spoke at least a little Greek, and or Julius, being Roman, was able to converse with them in Latin, though I suspect the former, since Luke was able to record the gist of what the people were saying about Paul. We have no reason to believe that Luke spoke Latin, though I suppose it's not out of the question. Being a doctor and all, he might very well have known some, but we don't know enough about his history. They propose that though Paul had been saved from the sea, Dike has not permitted him to live, right? And that's the word we have here. It's capitalized in our English as justice. So I thought that was interesting because they appear to be personifying justice. And the Greek here refers to right and justice. And in Thayer's, it can be referenced to the goddess Justitia. However, I wanted to take a small stretch here. And this is me taking a stretch. I always make it clear that that's what I'm doing, but maybe there's a possibility Luke actually interpreted or misinterpreted what he was hearing, because these men being identified as barbarians repeatedly suggests that they don't look like Greeks or Romans. And as such, there is a god of justice amongst, and this is ancient Arabic. Ancient Arabic peoples called Datin, which sounds very similar to Dike.
Yes.
And Datin was an oracular deity. There's very little known about him, meaning prophetic, but he was specifically the Arabic god of justice. So it's possible, and this is me stretching. Does it change the meaning of what we're reading here? Not at all. But, it's possible that that's because of that Carthaginian influence on the island and the Phoenician influence as well, they may have actually been referring to not the Greek deity because of their status as not being Greek, right? So consider what what we've learned about the bite of the sand viper. It's a particularly nasty bite. And so Luke tells us about Paul, right? It says he simply shakes the snake off in the fire. And as Luke writes it, apathen uden kakon. Pathen being to be affected, to feel, experience, suffer, be afflicted. Uden being not one, not any, nothing, and kakon being bad, evil, base, wrong, wicked, etc. So in other words, Paul experienced no ill effects from being bitten. This is in contrast, though, however, to our reference here in the English of saying no harm, which implies that he didn't even show signs of being bit. From the Greek, I don't think we can assume he was uninjured, but the focus here is on the venom that should have rapidly made itself known in Paul.
And killed him.
Right. And the thing we should remember here is the idea that God works miraculously, but typically within the rules of the universe he created. So to protect Paul, he could have prevented the snake from jumping, could have had the snake latching on in the first place, preventing that from happening. However, based on this, I would say God simply prevented the snake from injecting the venom.
Which I would consider more of a reality. And that though I remember a gentleman, and that was told that this pot of food they were eating was poisonous, which meant that it was making people sick and possibly killing many of the prophets. And so the prophet took some salt, prayed over it, tossed it in the pot and said, "You can eat it now." And everybody was fine. So God can change the rules, but he stays pretty much within a program. Yeah. We know that certain substances, if you have poison in your garden, you can turn around and get a soil sample and find out what the pH is, and you can change the pH and the plants will grow and not bother you at all.
Yeah. So, we have this then from Luke's account. We see the barbarians are watching Paul closely, expecting him at any moment to become pimprasthai. I mean, that literally means to blow up, or burn, like fever, right? But it also referred to swelling of a limb or that. Either that or they expected Paul to simply drop dead. They watched, they waited, and after waiting for some time, Luke notes that they decided that Paul must not be a murderer, but rather a god, which I find hilarious. And Luke notes that not just that they made this decision, but they actually declared it out loud. And that is, I didn't highlight that word here, but we have this elgon, and that literally means out, to declare verbally. So when they're saying said that he was a god, they're declaring it out loud. So that hits the end. We got 5 minutes left in the hour. So that's the end of where we're going to stop today. And so next time I'll finish up the rest of Acts. I'm pretty sure we'll get done. There's not a lot left.
No, there isn't.
So I'm going to throw out there again the question of input on where to go next. If anybody has any thoughts or suggestions, I'm still open to those. And after we do Acts, so there's a little bit of time still, because after we finish up Acts, I'll probably go back to that reviewing of the early church philosophies, the ecumenical councils, and touching base on that stuff again, to kind of do part 2 and possibly part 3 of that. So there's a little bit of time there, but I certainly would appreciate if there's any suggestions, direction, or preferences of where you guys would like to see me go next.
Right
So
now,
What's that?
I don't know. The thing that came to my mind was James.
James.
I love James.
That would be an interesting study. Okay. Yeah.
sounds good. It sounds really
I like
good.
that, actually. That's I hadn't even thought about jumping to a specific epistle, but yeah. Okay. That sounds good.
Well, just throwing it out there.
Okay. No, I'll think and pray about it and
Yeah.
see where God leads. But obviously, if you have any other thoughts or ideas, I had thrown out the idea of either continuing to Romans or going back to the Gospels. But I do like James as well. I think that would be interesting to break down and try and dig a little deeper into it and see what we can find in the writings of James. So awesome.
Okay.
Yeah. Would you like to close this, Stead?
I'll pray for us. Father, your word is rich. It has been living for all time. We have nothing more to hang on to. It's the rock that anchors us to you and gives us a way to live when all around us is sinking sand. So many ideas. The ideas that are here today are ideas of the past that failed. They're ideas that would drive us crazy or destroy our lives. But as long as we hang on to your word and understand it, as long as we hang on to you, we'll ride through this storm. Though it shoves and pushes us to an island, we'll get off the ship safely.
Amen.
And Father, we thank you for that. But it's a ship that we really don't want to get off of. It's a ship that we know will lead us home. And we bless your holy name and thank you for the study. In the name Adonai Yeshua HaMashiach, and as I say, in the name of Jesus, who we were taught, thank you. Amen.
Amen.